Hi everyone, let's start again with a new section of To Trap the Tortured Soul by Pamela Manresa. Section 2, The Dynamics of a Fragile Mind. Sticks and stones can leave bones broken and the skin an ugly blue, but words forever haunt the mind and tear the soul in two. Chapter 5, Fear. 14 months earlier. Jody Warren lived in a constant state of angst, an internal disquiet she'd lived with so long it had become her norm. I'm sorry. I'm fighting a cold, so bear with me. On this particular morning, though, the dread had turned to an uneasy fear. She had found bruises on her daughter's back she suspected had been put there by her boyfriend, Travis. He was a problem she didn't know how to handle. She wanted to go running into the street screaming and shouting and cause Travis severe physical pain, but she knew Doug would never allow such outwardly egregious behavior. Besides, Jody had no real proof it was Travis, and Audra had been avoiding her for over a week, ever since she had inadvertently walked in on her daughter standing in front of the bathroom mirror in panties and bra. Audra had screamed at her mother to get out. She did, but not before seeing the fading purple bruises across her daughter's neck and shoulders. Jody inwardly debated talking to Doug about what she'd seen, but he had always stressed to her that all household problems were hers to deal with, and he did not like being bothered by trivial matters. Those were the words he used, trivial household matters. He considered anything to do with their kids to fall under this category. School issues like teacher conferences, doctor and dental appointments, and silly childhood squabbles. She had lain awake for a third night in a row pondering if Audra's bruises went beyond the realm of household problems. Did it compare to a broken water pipe that Doug would insist on knowing about because it would require money to fix? Or would he consider it a silly squabble between two infatuated teenagers? Weighing her concern for her daughter against breaking one of Doug's many dictates was what had kept her awake at night worrying. This problem with Audra wouldn't cost any money, but there was definitely something broken. As the sun forced its outstretched arms of light through the crack of her window curtains and blared its optical alarm into her eyes, Jody wearily climbed out of bed, her head sore from lack of sleep, thankful the night was finally over. With her mind on her oldest child and hoping for a moment alone with her before the rest of the family woke up, Jody grabbed her robe off the end of the bed, careful not to wake Doug. She slipped into her robe and headed for the door. Walking briskly but quietly down the hall, she peeked her head around the door of Audra's room. Before she could wake her daughter with a timid good morning, she realized she was too late when she saw that Audra was already out of bed and the shower and the Jack and Jill bathroom she shared with her sisters was running. Jody slowly withdrew her head and resigned herself to another day of worry. Feeling defeated, she walked down the hall to the kitchen like a wounded soldier too tired to care about impending danger. As she stood at the kitchen counter in her immaculate kitchen preparing the coffee, Doug came into the room holding a blue dress shirt. She hadn't realized he had been awake when she had left their bedroom and knew her senses were slow because of her exhausted state. Holding the shirt in front of him like a matador's cape, he scolded her. "Jody, I told you that when you iron my shirts, make sure you concentrate on the sleeves. Just look at these wrinkles. I wanted to wear this today and now I can't." "I'm sorry, Doug. It must have gotten wrinkled hanging next to the other shirts in the closet. Won't your suit jacket cover it?" "Oh, that's your answer for everything, isn't it? Instead of doing it right, you just expect me to keep my jacket on all day. Does it matter if it's 90 degrees outside?" he mocked in a high-pitched voice. "Just keep your jacket on, 'cause Jody doesn't have time to do things right. If you let me get the kids off to school first, I'll iron it real fast." She reached for the shirt, but he jerked it out of her reach. "Oh, don't bother. You wouldn't get it done right anyway." He flung the shirt on the back of a kitchen chair and headed to a cabinet for a cup. "I hope the coffee is at least ready." "It's almost done. I had a hard night, so I'm moving a little slow this morning." Jody stepped to one side in a subjugating move as Doug reached around her. He had never touched her in anger, but his words slapped her harder than any hand ever could, and it always made her cringe. "Listen to me," Doug scolded the back of her head. "I don't care how hard your night was. You know I have to be at work at 8, and I don't like having my morning routine disrupted because you can't sleep. You know that. So I expect breakfast to be on the table and you to pull yourself together by the time I get out of the shower. Understand? Yes, I'm sorry. Jody turned to face him as she slipped like a clumsy ice skater to the other side of the kitchen to the stove, hoping action would allay his anger. It really will only take me a minute to iron your shirt. Don't bother, I said. His snappish response had Jody surreptitiously look to the kitchen door, hoping none of the kids would walk in. Doug never allowed the children to see them argue, and if they did, he always found a way to blame her. Like a premonition of bad occurrences, Jody looked at the kitchen door just as Lexi walked in. Stopping dead in her tracks, Lexi eyed her parents as they both saw her enter the room at the same time. Unmoving, they watched her with the look of two thieves caught in the beam of a police searchlight. Recovering quickly, Doug reached for the discarded shirt and handed it to Jody in a gesture sweet with gratitude. Now, Jody, I already said not to bother yourself. You know I've told you to not make such a fuss over minor details. Once again, you've made a mountain out of a molehill. I'll just wear a different shirt. Bending at the waist, he air-kissed his wife on her cheek. To an observer, the kiss looked like an affectionate peck. To Jody, the recipient of this so-called kiss, it felt as if Doug had simply spit air at her face while making a smacking sound. You just worry about getting the kids to school. They're your first priority, not me. You should try and remember that. Doug walked out of the room past his daughter and gave her a wink. Morning, Pumpkin. Did you sleep well? Morning, Daddy, I guess. Giving her mother a cursory glance, she added, Morning, Mom. Morning, honey. Can I get you something to eat? Jody stood beside the stove, holding the blue dress shirt next to her breast, like a shield that would deflect the impending fault that would be hurled at her come evening. No, I'm not hungry. I'll just have some juice. Lexi walked past her mother and opened the refrigerator door with a pull so hard it made the condiments inside the door rattle like fragile bells. Jody stood still, watching for Lexi to make her choice, her daughter's obvious anger apparent in her movements. Before Jody could find her voice and ask Lexi what was bothering her, she heard Audra come out of her bedroom and run down the hall. I'm meeting with the college counselor after school today, so I won't be home until after 5. Bye. Audrey yelled the instructions to whoever wanted to listen as she slammed the front door. Breakfast moved fast and messy after that. Jody moved on automatic pilot, getting breakfast on the table and her other 3 children out the door. 30 minutes later, Doug pulled out of the driveway, waving at them as they headed down the sidewalk to their appropriate schools. Fortunately for Jody, Brooklyn Park Elementary was in the same direction as the high school, so Lexi always dropped her younger siblings off before continuing on to her own school. Jody watched the morning departure of her family from the plate glass window of her living room. She was finally alone and was hoping to catch a quick nap before starting on the list of chores Doug always wrote out for her each day. She stood lost in thought and watched Dougie J swing from his 2 sisters' hands as the 3 of them walked down the block for their last week of school. She could see Dayla scold him with the little jerk she gave his arm. In his usual fashion, Dougie J ignored his sister and continued to swing and skip down the sidewalk, reminding Jody of a jumping bean she'd seen once while on vacation. Staring out the window long after her kids had disappeared around the corner, Jody's thoughts battled her tired body for dominance as she lost herself in the predicament of uncertainty. Should she nap or should she start on her housework? Should she tell Doug about Audra or shouldn't she? Her groggy thoughts tumbled around each other like clothes in a washing machine. Without realizing, she had begun to squint against the morning sun as it had glided over the house and entered the window like an accusatory taskmaster. She had lost track of time as she stared into space, not knowing how long she had stood there thinking and worrying. She was brought out of her reverie by the tamping on the glass in front of her. She came out of her trance with embarrassment and waved back at her neighbor, Tony, who was staring at her and holding up 2 paper cups and giving them a little jiggle as if saying, Hey, sleepyhead, wake up, let me in. Jody turned from the window, shocked at how long she had stood there, and opened the door. Tony came in with her usual friendly forcefulness and handed Jody one of the cups of coffee she'd bought. Taking a sip of her own brew, she shook off the morning chill like a shivering mastiff. Jody, where were you? She asked. I must have stood outside your window for 5 minutes before I finally got your attention. Sorry, I guess I was just lost in thought. Are you just coming home? Yes, after stopping at Just Beans. I was on call last night, but I brought you a latte and thought I'd come by and vent a little. It's really nice of you. I can use this morning. Jody took the hot cup from her friend and took a tentative sip, glad for the distraction Tony offered. Antonia Luisa Cavallo, known to everyone she knew as Tony, had been a neighbor of Doug and Jody's for over 5 years. A transplant from New York's Little Italy, she had the spunk and vocabulary of someone from the wrong side of Manhattan. Reaching all of 5'6" when her top-knot bun was at its peak, she had hair so black it was almost purple, dark eyes, and the plump body of a manicotti-loving Donna. And inside her spice-laden interior were the complexities and fiery substance of any proud Italian-American. Being first-generation American, her parents were still steeped in their customs from the old country regarding marriage and family. So in order to escape a bad marriage that had been designed to specifically fit her parents' religious beliefs, Tony packed up her belongings one hot autumn day, rented a U-Haul, and tried to find a place as different from New York as she could find. That place happened to be Minnesota. On her sightseeing trip to Los Angeles, her car broke down on the northern border of the country's Bible Belt when she discovered a clean, cold, family-oriented state. The upside was it had very few Italians with archaic notions. Now, 5 years later, she had a house in the suburbs, a good job as a marketing rep, and a next-door neighbor she could confide in when the disturbing traits of human behavior invaded her nightmares from her volunteer work as a victim advocate, made it too difficult to sleep. Besides being a good friend, Jody had become Tony's own personal therapist when she needed someone to talk to. Jody was unlike anyone Tony had ever met, sweet-tempered, unassuming, modest, and most importantly, normal. And even though Tony was sure Jody probably cringed every time cuss words followed one of her horrific tales of abuse that came along with being a victim advocate, Jody never judged. Did you have a lot of calls last night? Jody's concern for her friend was only slightly hidden behind her curiosity with Tony's job as a volunteer. Yeah, why can't people ever hurt each other at a decent hour? Her response was said jokingly, but reflected a note of truth as Tony walked through the living room into the kitchen and sat at the table, making herself at home. I didn't leave the hospital until about an hour ago. I had to stay with a woman who didn't have a ride home. Was there a game last night or something? Jody asked Tony's retreating back as she followed her friend into the kitchen. Pulling a chair out for herself, she sat across from Tony as if she were the guest and not the hostess. Had to have been. Setting her cup of coffee down, Tony reached her arms over her head and arched backward, surprisingly flexible for her size. It never fails either. The Vikings lose, or the Twins miss a fly ball, or there's a full moon, or whatever excuse these men want to use, and some woman is going to get it. I've never understood that, Jody said with a furrowed brow. Why do men take sports so seriously it causes them to beat up someone they love? She had taken the lid off of the latte and began to stir a packet of sugar into the hot liquid. I don't think it's so much the game, Tony answered, as it is a way for them to blame their low self-esteem and jackass characters on someone else. Fortunately, last night was only a couple of domestic violence cases and no deaths. That's really a shame, isn't it? Sometimes I think being hit all the time would be worse than death, Jody commented while absently stirring the coffee. Sometimes you'd be right, but that's why I like coming over here. I need to see a normal family to keep everything in perspective. This statement gave Jody pause. An instinct like a fleeting whisper crossed her mind that she couldn't grab onto and caused her to silence her movements in mid-air. Tony noticed the silence enter the room like someone had opened all the windows and let in frigid air. Watching her friend for a moment, the silence becoming uncomfortable, Tony asked, "Did I say something wrong?" Jody looked up quickly. "What?" she asked hesitantly. Oh no, you didn't say anything wrong. I just meant that I need to see a happy marriage like yours and Doug's to help keep me sane, you know? Oh, sure, I understand, Jody slowly added, staring at her coffee as if the swirling mocha colors would reveal the answer to her elusive thoughts like a gypsy's tea leaves. Is anything wrong, Jody? Tony had leaned forward against the table and cupped her coffee with both hands and looked at her friend in a way that said, "You can tell me anything." What? Oh, no, nothing's wrong. Just tired, I guess. Jody responded a little too quickly. I mean, it's just really sad, isn't it? Girls being hit, and yet they seem to want to stay rather than leave. I guess I'm just having trouble figuring it out. And then, can you tell if a girl is really being hit? I remember you telling me lots of times that women claim they've run into doors or fallen down or something. That's true, but women do this because they're scared. Most times, if a woman rats out her husband or boyfriend or whoever, then the next time he goes around the bend and gets mad at her, it's going to get even worse. That's why a lot of women don't press charges. I remember this one time where the wife was swearing up and down that her and her husband had just been having a small disagreement, that she didn't need help and hadn't meant to call the cops. She was saying this while in an ambulance heading to the hospital with a broken arm. She was going to defend him no matter what because she knew next time it happened, he'd really beat her if she told. How do you know she wasn't telling the truth? That maybe she really didn't break her arm or by falling? How do you know she didn't want to accuse her husband of something he didn't really do? Not to belittle your questions, Jody, but that is exactly the mentality of a lot of abused people, trying to rationalize their excuses by denial. Most of them usually defend their abusers, but you can tell by the look in their eyes they're scared when they're doing it. Tony was drinking and talking as if they were just having a nice chat at a dinner party, trying to keep her instincts at bay. But Jody's questions were making Tony squirm in her seat as if the chair had suddenly turned to rock that wouldn't allow her to find a comfortable position. Tentatively, she pushed her cup aside as if it were blocking her path and looked Jody directly in the eyes. Jody, is something wrong? Or you may be trying to ask how I know if someone is being abused on a regular basis? Yes, that's it, like that. Jody's eyes blinked rapidly as she spoke, a habit that greatly annoyed her family. Notice that's not. Tony continued, ignoring her friend's telltale signs of stress. Sometimes it's hard to tell, she said, because these women become experts at covering it up. Most of the time they wear long sleeves and pants to cover up the bruises on their arms and legs. If there are bruises on their face, they apply heavy makeup. It's usually the meanest assholes who hit their wives and girlfriends in the face, though. But these men know their wives will never press charges, so they just don't care if the marks show. The law usually can't do a whole lot with them either. The ones you really have to watch out for are the men who are smart enough to hit their wives where the bruises don't show, like on their arms and legs and back. These are the men who get away with it for years because other people can't see the abuse and the women are too scared to come forward or too ashamed. After a few seconds of watching Jody's reactions to this news, Tony asked, Jody, this is making me very uncomfortable. Is someone you know being abused? Jody jerked her head up at Tony's question. What? Oh, no, of course not, she added a little too quickly. I was just lost in thought, thinking about what you do, just interested. She gave herself a mental shake, trying to clear the befuddlement of her mind. Because, you can talk to me if there's anything wrong. Tony tried to hide the anxiety in her eyes under a tone of nonchalance. Jody knew she had overstepped. Doug would be furious if he ever found out she had talked to Tony. Her blinking became more pronounced. Trying to hide her embarrassment with an unconvincing disguise of confidence, Jody started stacking the paper cups from the table. I should let you get home. I know you're probably exhausted from being on call last night. You should go right home and go to bed. Tony, taking the hint, nodded her head. Sitting back with a heavy sigh, she resignedly said, Yes, I am tired. I should get going. She got up and slowly headed for the front door. Jody got up to walk her friend out. Standing slightly behind her, she waited for Tony to open the door, aggressively wringing her hands as if trying to scrub off caked-on mud. Tony, her hands on the doorknob, her head bent, spoke to the floor. You will tell me if anything is ever wrong, won't you? Of course I would. If there was anything wrong, you'd be the first person I'd call. But don't worry, everything is fine, she lied. Tony hesitantly walked out the door. Once outside, she turned and looked through the Warren's plate glass window to give Jody one last wave. Jody waved back at Tony and watched her walk away. Once she was out of sight, Jody sat down in the armchair by the door and stared at her hands. The ringing had turned them red, and she had actually hurt her left wrist from bending it forward. She sat for several minutes trying to compose herself. She could feel a strong pressure in her chest like someone was sitting on it. The anxiety started clawing its way to the surface of her conscience. She shuddered. She mentally went over her conversation with Tony, furtively hoping she hadn't revealed anything that would cause Doug to become angry if he found out. But she couldn't remember everything that had been said. Fact was, she couldn't remember the few moments between Tony explaining how to recognize abuse to the moment she had asked if anything was wrong. She wrapped her arms around herself and slowly started rocking back and forth. She sat for a few moments, willing her system to return to normal. Her mind played a litany over and over. If Doug were to find out, if Doug were to find out. She continued to sway, feeling her own apprehension, wanting desperately to understand the root of it all, its creation. But being strong enough to understand her own truth, her inner self, was not one of Jody's strong points. That had been trained out of her long ago. Afraid to utter what her soul knew to be the truth, to give it life by uttering its name, she denied what was easily recognizable to anyone else. She was sure if she said its name aloud, it would overtake her senses and consume her. It, the word that described its own meaning and took strength from simply being acknowledged, was fear. Thank you. Thanks for listening through the mistakes. See you later. Bye. Hi again. Chapter 6, Verbal Wounds. Jody, what are you doing? I've got to get going or I'm going to be late. Irritated, Doug pulled his golf bag from the hall closet. Archer is waiting, and if I'm late, you know we'll miss our tea time. He's almost ready, Jody yelled over her shoulder as she tugged Dougie J's sweater over his head. Now listen, you behave yourself at the party, okay, sweetie? And make sure you say thank you to Mrs. Johnson for inviting you. Are we going to have cake? Dougie J inquired about the issue that was the most important in his 5-year-old mind. Oh, you're going to have cake and play games and there'll be balloons, Jody responded as she put Dougie J's gift in a plastic bag so it would be easier for him to carry. Jody, for God's sake, what's the holdup? Doug was standing at the garage door, clutching his car keys at his side so tightly his knuckles were white. He's ready. Come on, Dougie. Your daddy's waiting. Doug held the door open for his son. Get in the car, buddy, and I'll be right there. Okay. Bye, Mom. Dougie J bounced the car while the plastic enclosed gift dragged the cement behind him. What time are you going to pick him up? Doug wanted to know, checking his watch. Monitoring Jody's time and activity was a duty he took seriously. The girls are going to pick him up this afternoon at 4. I don't think I'll be back from Mother and Dad's until 5. Where are the girls anyway? Monitoring his daughter's behavior was in direct contrast to the amount of energy he expelled on watching his wife's. In his mind, the children are Jody's responsibility, but Jody was his, as long as he approved of her directives with the children, of course. Audrey and Lexi are shopping for prom dresses, and Dayla is spending the day with Amanda. Dayla was at Amanda's last weekend. Don't you think that the Fergusons might be getting tired of always having her at their house? His question held an edge she was all too familiar with. It told her she had forgotten a rule, she just wasn't sure which one it was. Quick to alleviate his temper, Jody tried to soften the situation with the only excuse she had at her disposal. They asked me last weekend when I picked her up if they could keep her and take her to the zoo this weekend because there's a special exhibit of baby animals, and I told her she could go. Since I knew I was going to have to be at Mother and Dad's this weekend anyway, and I knew you'd be golfing, I thought it would be okay. Still trying desperately to lighten Doug's mood, she explained offhandedly, if not a little too fast. I know they're together a lot, but girls that age think they can't go one day without seeing their best friends. Don't patronize me, Jody. I'm not so stupid that you have to explain my own daughter to me. And I know Audra has a date with Travis tonight, so I doubt she's going to want to stay home and babysit. Doug was anxiously pacing, weighing his need to leave for his golf date with his need to correct Jody's decisions. Jody hesitated, trying to decide if she should voice her concerns for their oldest daughter. Quietly, she said, I was thinking of asking her to postpone her date tonight. Doug asked in a dismissing tone as he counted his clubs. Why would you want to do that? I'm just a little worried about her is all. I don't think she and Travis are getting along right now, and I think it might be good for her to take a break. Oh, I'm sure she'd like that right before prom, Doug condescendingly retorted. You just leave those two alone. They probably had some kind of little tiff over some insignificant teenage crap. It's normal at their age. Sometimes, Jody, you can be so overdramatic. Deciding his already immaculate clubs were all there, he straightened slowly, and like a 6-year-old boy fascinated by a scab, he picked at the one issue that always led to an argument, her over-the-top sense of obligation to her parents. Tell me again why you're going all the way to St. Cloud to water your parents' plants when your sisters live right there in town. Why do you always feel like you're the only one who can help them out? Jody knew it was Doug's way of showing his displeasure at her catering to her parents, as he liked to call it. She always felt it gave him some kind of perverted pleasure to start a fight right before she would have to go, as if the enjoyment of his day was in direct relation to how miserable he could make hers. But even understanding this, his words cut into the open wound of her unfounded guilt toward her parents and split the scar a little deeper each time. In her usual fashion, Jody tried to diffuse the conversation with explanations that excused her sisters. Nora can't make it because she has a teachers' conference, and Bridget has to work at the Mall of America. All of this was true. The problem was, however, that it was true the last time their parents were out of town, too. To Jody, it was easier to tell a couple of little white lies than to listen to Doug berate her. In truth, Jody didn't know why Nora couldn't go to their parents' house to help out when she only lived 3 miles away from them. As for Bridget, she was always excused from helping out because she lived in South Minneapolis, and it was just too far for her to travel. But being the baby of the family, Bridget had always been excused whenever there were extra duties, as Jody's dad always made a point to tell her. Since the day Bridget was born and their Swedish grandmother had dubbed her a little prinsessin, she had forever remained Daddy's little princess. For 26 years, Bridget had always been exempt from just about anything she didn't like to do. In the secret corners of Jody's mind, a place she seldom let herself explore, her sister's indifference toward their parents' needs was something she envied, but not something she would allow herself to feel. Ingrained into her psyche from the delicate age of 4, her unworthiness of having been born a girl had been drilled into her mind by a father who resented the fact that his oldest child had not been born a boy. This guilt had been passed to her like she had purposely usurped the position and prevented the son that he could have been. Jody continued her explanation to Doug to assuage his anger. Besides, I don't mind. I'm just going to water their plants, pick up their mail, and maybe do a little yard work. I thought it would be a nice welcome home gift for them. You not minding is not the point. They've only been gone a week. It's not like they went on a world cruise. Besides, if you'd take a more active role in your own children's lives and stop acting like a whimpering child when it comes to your parents, maybe your kids wouldn't feel so neglected by you. You should have been the one to take Dayla and Amanda to the zoo. And right this moment, you should be with your oldest daughters helping them pick out their prom dresses. Neglected? Her girls felt neglected? This statement made her lungs compress and made it hard for her to draw in a breath of air. But Doug, she tried to explain over the instantaneous pressure in her chest, I didn't know about the zoo exhibit, and Audrey and Lexi are shopping with their bunch of friends. They're making a day of it. I don't think they wanted any of the mothers to go. You really do live in an alternate reality, don't you? His question was rhetorical. It's not that they didn't want you tagging along. It's that they didn't want to be embarrassed by you, knowing you don't know the first thing about today's fashion. But they told me it was to be girls only today, she squeaked out, not understanding why it was so important to her that he understand. She secretly wished she hadn't sent Dougie J to wait in the car. Doug never criticized her in front of other people, even their kids. Fine, I don't have time to argue with you. Just make sure you're home in time to fix dinner. His final command was emphasized with the slam of the garage door. "I will, I promise," she said to his retreating back. As Doug drove away to take their son to his third birthday party that month, Jody stood transfixed in the kitchen. She didn't know what to focus on. Her husband's accusation that she was neglectful, that her girls may be embarrassed of her, or the constant necessity to please her parents. Mentally shaking herself free of the heaviness Doug's words had left her feeling, she started moving quickly, knowing she had to get going in order to get back in time to fix dinner. She picked up her car keys, slipped on her coat, and headed for the car, all the while reliving Doug's words in her mind. Those words, those harsh words that continued to swirl through her brain like a whirlpool, circling, colliding, confusing, sucking her self-worth down to the dark depths to join her slowly fading identity. Her children felt neglected. Jody always enjoyed driving, and the hour and 10-minute drive to her parents' home was no exception. She had a ritual for any long trip. First, she would stop at the McDonald's in a small strip mall next to the highway for a large Diet Coke. Then she would set her car radio to the soft rock station, adjust the back of her car seat to a slight incline, then sit back and enjoy the scenery as she drove. It was her chance to let her mind relax. She was hoping that her confrontation with Doug would not spoil the drive she had looked forward to, and she could get into the rhythm she needed to enjoy it. She wished she could ease her mind by talking to the girls, to see if they needed anything, and a way to prove to herself that she was not neglectful. But she knew calling them while they were with their friends was an unforgivable sin. As if fate had intervened, her cell phone rang as she hit the highway. She took her eyes off the road long enough to hit the on button. "Hello," she answered. "Mom, it's me," Audra sounded out of breath. "Oh, Audra, I'm so glad you called. Are you having a good time? Do you need anything?" Jody could hear a gaggle of giggles in the background and knew her daughters were enjoying their shopping day. "Lexi wants to know how much Daddy is letting us spend on shoes." Ignoring Audra's need to get her daddy's approval, Jody took a chance of making the decision herself. "I don't think you should go over 60. Jody could tell Audra had failed in her attempt to cover the mouthpiece of her phone as she shouted over the noise of the mall to her sister. "Lexi, Mom says you can spend up to 60. Lexi's high squeal could be heard over the phone. "Yay, I'm running back to DSW and get the black ones I saw." "Mom, are you sure it's okay with Dad for both of us to spend 60? Maybe I should call him." Audra's practicality was one of the traits that made Jody proud, but at the same time her daughter's constant second-guessing any of her decisions always hurt just a bit. "Yes, I'm sure it's all right, and there's no need to bother him while he's golfing." "Okay, if you're sure. Gotta go. See you later." "Audra, wait," Jody repeatedly yelled. "Don't forget to pick up Dougie J at 4. "Audra." "I know, Mom. God, you've only told me twice already. Do you think I'm so irresponsible that I'd forget my own brother?" "No, I'm sorry, honey. Of course not. Listen, you two have fun, and I'll see you later this afternoon." "Fine," Audra responded snappishly. "I gotta go." Audra hung up the phone before Jody could say her goodbye. Jody shut off her phone and dismissed her daughter's rude tone as typical teenage attitude. She turned up the radio and forced herself to relax back into the driver's seat, ready to enjoy the drive north to her hometown of St. Cloud. 20 minutes down Highway 94, the open space and colored scenery of Minnesota's byways had its usual calming effect on Jody's nerves, as if she was wrapped in the warmth of a soft winter sweater. It was early May, but the snow in Minnesota would linger late into the month as the fragile heads of baby plants fought their way to the surface, hungry to be nourished by the sun like baby birds in a brittle nest. The colors of sparse wildflowers mingled with the spring golds of the prairie grasses. Early awakened leaves shimmered from the sun as the trees competed with each other to be closest to its heat. The various greens of trees combined with the dark purples and maroons of the leafy shrubs protected the creamy mounds of white snow that lay beneath them. This last visage of winter refusing to melt and surrender to summer reminded Jody of huge bouquets of flowers sitting on fragile lace doilies. She never tired of marveling at all the different colors of green that Mother Nature provided. From the dark hunter green of the spruce trees, the apple greens of early blossoms from the fruit trees, to the Kelly and alpine greens that intermingled with the browns of bare limbs and the sunflower yellows of rebirth as new trees yearned for dominance like sentries that cordoned off the highway from the fields, and a farmland tiered into the hillside like a green wedding cake. Passing the rural stretches of land and scattered houses put her at ease, and she let her mind drift into a much-needed peace. The highway to St. Cloud was never busy in the middle of the morning, and she could relax enough to scan the open spaces of multicolored landscape that melded together. Out of the corner of her eye, the colors blurred together as she sped by, creating a fusion of watercolor as if Monet himself had painted the scenery. It was soothing, beautiful, and comfortable. Bright sunshine and brisk air made a day that had started out hurtful into a day of hope. Sweet Dreams by the Eurythmics came on the radio and had Jody's mind remembering the words that Doug had accused her of earlier, living in an alternate reality, a dream. Surprisingly, the idea did not disturb her. In truth, it was a pleasant thought. An alternate reality, she mused, one where angry words did not exist and feelings were treated like spun sugar, too delicate to be handled roughly. The image ran through her head, helping her calm down. Driving up to her parents' house, she noticed a fine layer of snow still covered their driveway. Being that their front door faced north, cold weather hovered in their entrance longer than anywhere else. Ironically, it was synonymous with the way the house made her feel whenever she entered it, cold and isolated. As she got out of her car and walked across the drive to the front door, she noticed the snow was more ice than snow. It crunched beneath her feet and made a crackling sound. It had snowed and then had frozen because of the lack of sunshine. She knew that a standard snow shovel would not remove the snow and would simply leave the cement an icy slope. As a favor to her aging parents and a nice surprise on their return home, she decided she would get out the snowblower and clear the hard-packed danger before she left. She spent the first hour and a half of her visit collecting mail and sorting it, watering houseplants, gathering up the recycle bins and putting them on the curb, doing a load of laundry and shoveling up dog poo from their backyard. Eddie, her dad's pride and joy, was a mean, muscular little bulldog named after Ed Asner, the boss on the 1970s The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Her dad spoiled Eddie relentlessly and took him everywhere. All through the winter, the dog would do his business along the edging that lined the flower beds along the back fence. Due to the recent snow melt, it became apparent that the task of picking up after the dog would be necessary as she walked out back to empty the trash. She thought happily that her dad would particularly appreciate her doing this unpleasant job for him. With just over an hour before she had to leave for home, Jody went over in her mind again about clearing the driveway. She knew handling the big snowblower would be a challenge for her, but her parents were getting older and it would be safer for them to get their luggage inside the house if the walk was clear. She made the conscious decision to try and maneuver the machine in what she hoped would be a much appreciated gesture. She thought how happy her dad would be to see it done when they got home, knowing he wouldn't have to do it. The snowblower was buried in the garage behind the barbecue grill and some tools. She wondered why her dad had put it in such an inconvenient place. It took a lot of tugging and lifting for Jody to drag the blower out from behind the items, and then it took her several minutes to get it started. She finally positioned herself behind the blower as she walked it over the cement, letting it eat away at the ice-encrusted snow. The snowblower was a 10-year-old monstrosity that was a little heavy for her to use, but one her dad refused to replace. It took all of her strength to keep it in a straight line. After 25 grueling minutes, she was finally finished. Sweating, with her back aching, she began reversing the process of getting the blower back into its place in the garage. She hadn't thought to bring gloves, and her hands had become cold and raw, but she was pleased with her effort and just knew it was going to make her dad proud of her. As Jody bent down to lift a heavy toolbox back into place, she heard a car drive up behind her. Smiling, she turned around just as her parents were getting out of the car. Eddie was the first to jump from the car, running toward her and snarling like he'd never seen her before. Secretly, she really hated that dog. She laid the toolbox down to put a barricade between herself and Eddie. Smiling, she greeted her parents. Mother, Dad, you're home early. I thought you weren't getting back until tomorrow. Just a second. Yeah, we were going to put your Uncle Gunther's gout flared up, but your uncle sorry. Yeah, we were going to, but your Uncle Gunther's gout flared up. Duluth is hard on him this time of year, don't you know? Jody knew her mother meant the town of Duluth. Her mother's Minnesota accent always became more apparent whenever she was tired, and she recalled that the trip north was always a long one. Katie Olson walked up to her daughter and gave her a hug. What are you doing here? I thought I'd come by and check on the house and do a few errands for you. Hope apparent in her eyes, Jody continued. I just wanted your first day home to be relaxing without you having to think of doing any chores. Joe Olson walked into the garage, eyeing the toolbox Jody had set down. What are you doing with the toolbox? Is something broken? His tone reflected a panicked worry. No, nothing's broken. I was putting it back. I got out the snowblower and got the snow off the driveway for you. It had turned to ice and I didn't want you to slip on it. You used the snowblower? Yes. Wasn't that okay? Jody's hopeful mood was slowly sliding down her spleen. Didn't you have trouble getting it started? Her dad's voice was rising in pitch with each sentence. Well, a little, but I always have trouble getting blowers started. You didn't check to see if there was any oil in it, did you? Joe's tone was accusatory. Oil? Now, Joe, Katie tried to intervene. She couldn't have known. She ran the blower without oil in it. He was eyeing Jody like she was a convict just escaped from prison. Barking at her, he asked, Do you know what you've done, girl? You've probably broken my blower. I didn't, Jody tried to say. It still runs. Running it without oil in it breaks it. Don't you know that? Daddy, I'm sorry. I didn't know. But I'm sure it's not broken. It was working fine. Jody started working her way around her father to the front of the garage, giving him a wide berth as if distance would diffuse her guilt. Of course you think it was working fine because you don't know your head from a hole in the ground. You should know by now that blowers always have to be emptied of its oil before storing them for the summer. You've seen me do it a million times. He reached down and shoved the toolbox to the side and started yanking at the grill to get to the snowblower. I was only trying to help, really. I didn't know you had already decided to put it away for the summer. Jody looked at her mother for support. Joe continued his tirade. What have I told you about her, Katie? What? She's always making trouble. Do you know what it's going to do to cost to fix this? The question was rhetorical. Joe, calm down. You know she didn't mean it. Jody began to shake. Her father's temper frightened her. Eddie came toward her and made an attempt to nip her ankle. Daddy, if it is broken, I'll pay to get it fixed. Really, girl, you'll pay? He snorted sarcastically. You mean your husband will pay? Getting her courage up, Jody came forward to help her dad dig out the machine. Let's try and start it, okay? Just to see. Don't touch it. Haven't you done enough? He jerked the toolbox she had grabbed from her hand. Go home. You've done enough damage, he shouted. Jody, baby, her mother said carefully, maybe you should go on home now. Mother, Jody turned toward her mother with tears in her eyes. I really am sorry. I was just trying to help. I know, but it's best if you go on home now. Jody backed away, looking from her mother's pleading face to her dad's bulging back. Finally, she turned and started slowly walking toward her car. Deliberately, as if he knew she hadn't yet reached her car, her father said, She's always been nothing but trouble. I wish you'd never given birth to that girl. Jody stopped dead in her tracks. The pain from her father's words felt like a scalpel opening her chest and letting the life flow out of her body in a sharp, bitter sting that paralyzed her. Katie flinched at her husband's harsh words. Joe! She turned toward her daughter's hunchback, knowing she had heard the words herself. The tone of his wife's voice made Joe turn. He saw Jody standing still in the middle of the drive. Jody heard his reply to his wife saying his name. Was his only reply. Katie ran into the house, grabbed Jody's car keys and purse, and quickly walked back to her daughter. Wrapping one arm around her shoulders and handing Jody her belongings, she said, You know he really doesn't mean it, Jody. He's just upset, that's all. She walked Jody to her car. You go on home now, and I'll give you a jingle later in the week. Jody got in her car like a rubber doll. She started the engine and slowly made a U-turn in the street. She looked in her rearview mirror as she drove away and saw her mother trying to placate her father. Strangely, as if the sky had suddenly turned dark, the things in her world slowly began lost in shadows. By the time she had reached the driveway, her mind was numb. One more time. Strangely, if the sky had suddenly turned dark, the things in her world slowly became lost in shadows. But by the time she had reached the highway, her mind was numb. Her father wishes she had never been born. The words kept going around and around in her head, but she couldn't cry. If only she could cry. She'd always felt that he didn't like her, but never hated. Now she knew the truth because he'd been able to say it without the least sign of regret. The drive back down Highway 94 was made in a surreal state. The bright spring trees she had passed coming up, the ones that had given her so much pleasure with their growth and colors, seemed strangely large and ominous. They were no longer the normal-sized trees, but had grown 50 feet taller in the short time she'd seen them last. In fact, the whole world seemed to have gotten bigger. Suddenly, with frightening clarity, she realized it wasn't the world that had grown, but it was she who was smaller. A panic overtook her. It was an anxiety attack, but more intense than she had ever felt before. She had had feelings of severe nervousness before, and what her mom called the jitters, sometimes when she was away from her kids too long. Those attacks always had her fearing that if she didn't get home, something terrible would happen. But this attack was different, more intense, scaring her. She began to feel she was shrinking away, slowly sliding from life like ink on a wet page. No meaning, no substance, no existence. Soon she would be gone, giving meaning to those words her father had so callously said. Thank you, and I'll see you later.